How can Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people be transformed into Israeli-Palestinian coexistence? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Jonathan Graubart. Jonathan Graubart is a professor of political science at San Diego State University, where he is also an advisor for its international security and conflict resolution program. His latest book is Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs, and which was published this year by Temple University Press. Jonathan Graubart, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Oh, thank you very much, Mouin. My pleasure, too.
The generally accepted definition of Zionism is Jewish nationalism, a state in which Jewish citizens collectively achieve political supremacy by establishing demographic and territorial hegemony. Zionist leaders from Theodor Herzl onward and their Israeli successors additionally viewed great power sponsorship as critical to the establishment and preservation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Your book, Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, examines Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt to explore a different strand of this movement, Humanist Zionism, which advocated Jewish self-determination while rejecting both nationalism and imperialism. So my first question to you would be, for the uninitiated, what were the main elements of Buber and Arendt's Humanist Zionism?
Right. I mean, you could neatly sum it up as Jewish liberation, but, to flesh it out a little bit, the affirmative part was Jewish communal living in what's historically regarded as their spiritual center. So ancient Israel, now Israel-Palestine, as a place for revitalizing the Jewish community, Jewish values, as a place for developing a new model of egalitarianism, social justice that would be an inspiration both for the Jewish community, but also globally. So it would be in collaboration with what was hoped for a global social justice project. And there was also, and of course, a model for just coexistence with Palestinians, which we'll get into more later. So that was the affirmative thing of what Jewish liberation meant for the humanist Zionists. And then as an oppositional force, it was quite upset at the mainstream, and influenced by Theodor Herzl, but really taking momentum after the Balfour Declaration of 1917 to focus on Jewish supremacy, essentially a Jewish nation state, and to disregard the interest of the indigenous Palestinians and to negotiate and work with the imperialist overseers, so the British after the Balfour Declaration. So that was the ideas of Arendt and Buber, broadly speaking. They had different things they focused on, but that's
and they weren't contemporaries, really. Arendt came somewhat later than Buber.
Yeah, so Buber is born in 1878. Yeah, 1878, and Arendt's born in 1906. Buber is already active in this alternative humanist Zionism by the decade of the 1910s. Arendt doesn't get involved really until the 1940s. Yeah.
And Buber,
they don't interact directly.
And Buber emigrated to Palestine. Arendt emigrated to the United States.
Yeah, even Buber, he doesn't emigrate till he's 60 years old. He got some criticism for that, someone who was kind of so involved in leading this strand of Zionism. He himself doesn't move to Palestine until 1938. So he too had other interests besides Zionism.
And how did they square the circle of Jewish self-determination in Palestine with the existence of an indigenous Palestinian majority. I mean, some might argue, well, Zionism without nationalism is a bit like trying to achieve socialism through the private sector.
Yeah. Well, I mean, their main opposition to the mainstream Zionists was the fact that the mainstream Zionists disregarded the indigenous. So to them, and to Buber in particular, this was the essential test of Zionism. Would it pass the test of a just coexistence with the indigenous Palestinians? So I would break it up into a few ways of thinking about. One is that, well, abstractly, if the idea is to develop a just Jewish community that's living in peace and coexistence, there's not inherently any tension with the indigenous Palestinians. There would only be tension if you're working with the imperialist overseers and looking to displace the Palestinians. So in principle, there's not any problem. But someone like Buber, first of all, they of course understood that Zionism in practice was very much in opposition and operating as an injustice to the Palestinians. Buber's idea, he was the most thought out. He did step back and acknowledge that it's going to be an intrusion. It's a new group of people coming in, so it's going to be, like it or not, we're going to have some kind of discomfort and affect the lives of the indigenous Palestinians. He maintained, for various reasons, as a humanist Zionism, that the Jewish attachment to that land still justified the Jews doing it. And so the way he saw it is, this is one of the many tensions that come into being when different communities have to interact. And so rather than ignoring it or going the mainstream Zionist route of just trying to amass power so one can eventually displace the Palestinians, is minimize the intrusion and develop better relations. So the point for Buber, he called it, let's eliminate the political surplus, is that yes, we do want to build our own community in Palestine.
Community as opposed to state.
Right, a community as opposed to state. That is going to be some kind of intrusion, but obviously, I mean, in his mind, we're not going to form a state. We're going to work hard to minimize the disruption, to minimize the injustice. So that's why the ideas for him, to reaching out to the Palestinians, working out a way to settle together with the Palestinians, as he put it, and beyond just working out, a conventional political compromise with the Palestinian Arabs, his higher goal was a new synthesis where the Jews and the Palestinians would come together and develop a new model of coexistence, working toward shared values of a more just society.
And that's Buber. Would it be fair to say that Buber was perhaps more preoccupied with the practical implications of his vision, while Arendt was more preoccupied with the ideological dimensions of it?
Yeah, that is a good way of putting it. Buber is also more preoccupied with thinking through how to do the reckoning and the reconciliation. So the reckoning with the disruption and the injustices already inflicted on the Palestinians and the project of reconciliation. For Arendt, it is much more of this ideological, philosophical element of how we can get past centuries of imperialism and nationalist conflict and come up with an alternative model.
How would you respond to the argument that humanist Zionism, in opposing nationalism and imperialism, was never a serious competitor to the mainstream of the Zionist movement, that in the person of David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, and others, embraced and was empowered by nationalism and imperialism? Was the marginalization and effective disappearance of humanist Zionism a foregone conclusion, or in your view, the product of specific historical developments?
Well, I mean, what most interests me and what inspired me to write this book is not so much of what if, could some things have happened that they would have won out. It's much more their lessons of a type of coexistence or something that's is all the more vital in the present. So I'm most interested in here we can find the foundational ideas of how to rethink Jewish self-determination in a way that's not an either-or game. I would say that while it's probably true that the odds were stacked against them in an age where the popularity of nation states was really following that they were going against the trend, but they weren't as weak as may commonly framed. Is that they did have a decent appeal among the Jewish community in Palestine. Many Jews who thought about it outside of Palestine were hoping for something that wouldn't be an either or clash. And even the most enlightened, let's say, British officials or even Americans who were hoping that we could somehow get out of this without an all-out war between the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs, this was the only framework for thinking through how you could honor the national identity of both peoples without an all-out conflict. So it wasn't as much of a pipe dream as it's sometimes portrayed, but I'm not going to deny that it was running against powerful trends, and so it's not surprising that it lost out.
And do we have information about efforts that they made to reach out to the Palestinians or surrounding Arab countries to develop and promote their ideas, and what the reception was to them?
Yes, both Martin Buber and his common collaborator, Judah Magnus, an American-born rabbi who probably was even more politically active than Martin Buber in trying to make this binational coexistence work. They were tireless, Magnus even more so, in reaching out to different Palestinian groups and groups outside of Palestine to work out some kind of model of coexistence. They had some receptivity. They also, well, I mean, they were reaching out to British officials too. So in some ways they got more receptivity, for example, from the Anglo-American Committee that meets in 1946 to try to help figure out what to do with this territory after World War II. So they had mild success in reaching out. I think the bottom line among Palestinian and other Arab groups that knew about them is probably twofold. One is still the idea that, look, this is an overwhelming majority Arab, so binational still sounds like unjust. But the second one was an understanding that this might be nice, but they're too weak, Buber and company. And so, even to getting back to your last question, if the Palestinian community had been stronger vis-a-vis the Zionist Jewish community and there had been more of a standoff, then there might have been more prospects for the binational ideas of Buber, Magnus, Arendt to prevail. But because the Jewish side, the prevailing mainstream side, was so much more powerful, they didn't have any pressure to kind of compromise. And then from the Palestinian Arab end, it all, I think, looked fairly bleak. And so the idea of a real synthesis, the conditions just weren't there.
Your book argues for a revival of binationalism in Israel-Palestine, while drawing upon the Humanist Zionist tradition, you place contemporary binationalism beyond the Zionist framework, but also don't adopt an anti-Zionist one. Why do you oppose both Zionism and anti-Zionism as a paradigm for your binational approach? I think it's fair to say that most contemporary advocates of a binational approach would probably define themselves as anti-Zionists.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I guess if I was really forced into that binary of Zionist versus anti-Zionism, I'm much closer to the anti-Zionism because in practice, Zionism has become linked toward a hegemonic Jewish nation state.
Mhm.
The reason for the title of my book, Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, is to try to find that alternative framework. I originally toyed with just calling it an updated version of Humanist Zionism, but I think people like Judith Butler and others have argued that whatever appealing strands of Zionism existed prior to 1948, they got overwhelmed by the prevailing vision of Zionism.
As we were discussing a few minutes ago.
Exactly, right. The problem with calling it anti-Zionism is that it does suggest writing off even thinking about distinct Jewish self-determination in that territory.
Mhm.
And in fact, there's often some discomfort among those on the anti-Zionist community even talk about Jewish self-determination, the fear that it would legitimize what actually took place in the Zionist colonial project. Ultimately, I guess I agree with Edward Said in an interview he did with Ari Shavid, the Israeli journalist. Ari Shavid asked him, so, do you want to de-Zionize? And Edward Said answered, I'm not looking for Jews to commit harikari, to just write off. What I am looking for is a transformation or a reformation, as Edward Said put. And so I am too looking for a model that takes Jewish self-determination seriously. I think Zionism has too much baggage to keep that term. Anti-Zionism still, by and large, suggests opposition to Jewish self-determination. So I do fall back on just the term binationalism because I think at its heart, it does make way for distinct self-determination among two peoples. So that's how I do it. Other than that, I don't have a good new term other than binationalism.
So if I understand correctly, you're making the argument that Zionism, in a sense, can no longer emerge from the shadow of the Nakba and of the occupation, and on the other hand, anti-Zionism can no longer accommodate the principle of Jewish self-determination, even if that does not imply a Jewish state.
Yes.
Having said that, as you're no doubt aware, you're far from the only advocate of a binational approach. And what distinguishes your binational vision, both from other current advocates of binationalism and, for that matter, from proponents of a secular democratic state? Because I think one thing these proposals have in common is a one-state proposal for Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. So for the secular democratic proposals, that's more for making one's Jewish identity or Palestinian Arab identity more just a distinct ethnic trait, as opposed to something with institutional political significance. It's not that model bothers me. I just don't think it's a viable, desirable model among the vast majority of either Jews or Palestinian Arabs in the area. That is, these are two communities with very strongly felt identities. So just the generic secular democratic model strikes me as a non-starter in practice. That is, it doesn't have the institutional features to enable distinct autonomy of both peoples. Other binational ones, I mean, I looked at a fair amount. I guess one element I'm looking, we'll get to Noam Chomsky later, but in part he inspired me on this, is that I'm looking for practical ways to move forward on this binational vision. One state is perfectly fine with me. I would be happy with it developing into one state. I just don't think pragmatically that's the good starting point. Mm-hmm. I think a model that looks at what's progressive and appealing from the broader two-state global consensus, which is formulated around international humanitarian law norms, anti-aggression, that those things can be used effectively to put Israelis on the defensive. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot of elements to the accompanying norms of the global two-state consensus that can still be effectively utilized. The other thing, it goes along with an argument you've made, Mouin, is that directly calling for Israeli Jews to abandon any distinct states, say along the 1967 borders, is something that they're going to fight ferociously to prevent. And certainly there's not a military pathway to stopping that. Moving toward withdrawal, however complicated that is something that's still viable under the right set of circumstances. So the way I see it is one needs to work on radicalizing and binationalizing the two-state program. So that might be, it's a pragmatic differentiation from others that lead with a one-state model. I guess the other thing, just to wrap this up, is the way it would look in practice. I mean, if it were to happen abruptly, is, I mean, if it's the conditions they are now, where the Jewish community just has far more economic power, is they would likely still dominate in this single state. And so being able to strengthen Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian capacities and autonomy, I think having something that's a separate political state would be better for building up the capacity for a just coexistence among two equal groups. Right now, it's hard to, it would look somewhat like the South African model post-apartheid, where white society still dominates economically in terms of land. It's true that because there's a significant Black majority, Blacks dominate politically. In the case of a one-state Israel-Palestine, I think it would be even more dominated by the Jewish population because of
the differing demography compared to South Africa. Yeah. But I mean, in your latest response, you referenced viability and possibility and pragmatism several times. And when I hear you speak this way, I guess the obvious follow-up question is, well, if that's your approach, what is viable or pragmatic? Certainly if you look at the world as it exists today about any binational proposal. We were talking earlier about Humanist Zionism being dismissed as a pipe dream. Couldn't the same accusation be made about a binational approach in 2023?
In one sense, it's a pipe dream if it's going to happen anytime soon. But the way I look at it is, okay, it's binational already. empirically in terms of both the Jewish community and the Palestinian Arab community have a deep attachment to essentially all of, what's now greater Israel, Israel-Palestine. And so the issue is how to make it the most just. Ultimately, if one's going to, I guess it does come down more to justice than anything else. Is can one imagine a just coexistence of Jews and Palestinian Arabs where they have substantial autonomy, where they're able to kind of develop their own community and coexist and govern together on the territory at large? The binational offers a path for that. If it was a two-state based on a strict separation where the borders are closed between Israel and the future Palestine, it may be viable in a sense, but hardly appealing, and the deep tensions would still be there. So look, it's a tricky thing. And in one sense, nothing's viable in terms of a just resolution of Israel-Palestine. I think what binationalism does is it offers at least a more viable path to a just coexistence in either the two-state or the secular single-state model.
Your book makes numerous references to Noam Chomsky and also devotes an entire chapter to Edward Said and Ella Shohat for what you term lessons on reconciliation and coexistence. How did each of these thinkers influence your work and the binational framework that's the conclusion of that work?
Well, Noam Chomsky is my original influence. I discovered the book of essays called Peace in the Middle East, ? At a used bookstore in the early 1990s. That was the first I had heard of this alternative binational socialist.
And this was a book, I think, originally published in 1974.
Exactly, right, yeah. So, I mean, I already was a great fan of Noam Chomsky. I'd read his harsh but penetrating critical work on Israeli policies and US supports. And so he's the one that
had the fateful triangle.
The fateful triangle in particular, yes. Yeah. So I decided to use this as an opportunity to really look in depth and to look as an academic scholar at Chomsky's early essays between 1969 and 75. There's an essay in 75 that comes out in another volume that's also about the coexistence. So what I see him as doing is he's surveying the situation shortly after the 1967 war, both taking stock of what's happened to what was an exciting, including for a young Noam Chomsky, Zionist experiment after, at that point, about 2 decades of a state of Israel, and what was remaining of some of the old socialist democratic ideas, and could things be revived? So I think it's a good window into what was also kind of a pivotal time right after the 1967 war, where the land is united, I mean, under Israeli control and obviously in a very unequal militarist way, but the land is united. And so it's a first, I think, serious thought from a Jewish dissenting view who's receptive to the idea of some kind of liberatory Jewish self-determination to revive binationalism. So that appeals. And then what he's doing, I think, very effectively then is looking at the ominous consequences that now Israel is falling very directly into the US orbit of influence. This is going to push Israel deeper into kind of a militarist, imperialist element. He's also looking at the hardening of the American Jewish community. So both the prominent American Jewish organizations, but also American Jewish liberal intellectuals like a Michael Walzer. And so he's looking at there's this
who wrote a much cited work asserting that 1967 was the textbook example of what he would call a just war.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And so they had their back and forths back then. I think Michael Walzer had a really mean review of Chomsky's book in the New York
As
Times.
one would expect.
Yes, as one would expect. And then there was a back and forth between them. Certainly, I think Chomsky got the best of that. But yeah,
As one would expect as
right.
well.
Yeah. But Chomsky's broader point is that this is it's not only upsetting in terms of the hostilities expressing toward Palestinians, but it's unfortunate that American Jewish voices are egging on Israel to move toward a more unpleasant direction. And so this is going to lead to a less desirable Israel, ultimately, he argued, a less secure Israel. And so he's identifying these trends early on and arguing that there is a way out and to think about just qualities. But to get to that way out, there's both reviving the binational socialist Zionism of the pre-1948 era and reckoning with what Israel's already done, including the contradictions of aspiring to be a Jewish state and aspiring to be a democracy. So he's one of the first.
And when you say already done, are you referring only to the 1967 occupation, or does Chomsky also in that framework include the Nakba of 1948?
Oh, it includes the Nakba, includes martial law. That is, I mean, in a way, he's showing the contradiction between Israel as a Jewish state and as a democratic state.
Yeah.
Yes, right. But, he's excited that there's still some elements, say, of the kibbutzim, the socialist collectives, that have some appealing elements. And so he is looking to revitalize an alternative kind of Jewish self-determination. But it's updating it. It's saying that now we have to look at what's it going to look like with Israel under the orbit of US influence. That's a very dangerous trend. And so in those collection of essays, I think he puts together both the ominous trends of Israel now becoming part of the US orbit of influence and what are still possibilities for an alternative type, particularly now that the land at least is united again and temporarily borders are lifted. And then by the end of that phase while he's initially opposed to two states, thinking that this will just bring out the worst aspects of Zionism and the worst aspects of Arab nationalism for the Palestinians. But he decides by 73, 74 that's okay, there's various reasons that for the Palestinian community, they've now decided that this is kind of a phase in their development, that they need a distinct Palestinian nation state. And so he's one of the early ones that thinks, okay, we can think about this as a step toward radicalizing the two-state program. So the two-state program would be hand in hand with giving more resources to the Palestinian community, keeping borders open, and bringing actual full democracy and citizenship within Israel.
A transformative juncture towards a binational outcome?
Yes, right, yeah. And he does say this is a time also for the international socialist community to start thinking about these alternative models of, it's not getting rid of it's not just writing off all nationalism as inherently reactionary, but thinking about how do you enable generally multinational societies to exist in ways that bring out that enable their national identities without leading to a clash and advancing toward a shared purpose of socialist egalitarian societies.
So that's Chomsky. And as I was mentioning, you reference him repeatedly, but then you devote an entire chapter to Said and Shuhat. How do they contribute to the framework that you've developed?
Yeah, so yeah, I should say the book is primarily kind of about how to think about Jewish self-determination and justice from a Jewish perspective and how Jews can coexist in a just manner. But obviously, it implicates Palestinians is what first came to mind. So Edward Said is the most obvious candidate. And then, well, I'll get into Ella Shochat later. So I'll start with Said, is that he's the obvious choice. I mean, Arendt wrote about the conscious pariah among Jews, the one that challenges both oppression, anti-Semitism from the outside, but also hierarchy and oppression from within the Jewish community. So Arendt admired and saw herself as a conscious pariah. One can certainly see Edward Said as a conscious pariah among the Palestinian community. So on the one hand, he's a powerful critic of the Zionist political project. This is a variant of Western Orientalism that he lays out in a very elaborate, articulate manner. He also is one of the first, if not the first, to articulate a distinct vision of Palestinian liberation. And so the ones I was looking at, like Buber and Arendt, were mostly focused on ideas of Jewish liberation. So looking for kind of that Palestinian equivalent, Said certainly does that in a very thoughtful way. And then he's got his own vision of reckoning and reconciliation between the Palestinians and the Jews. So from the perspective of the victims of Zionism, there is still the need to understand the Jewish historical experience. All right, in his book, Question of Palestine, at one point he writes, the most difficult thing about being a Palestinian is that we're the victim of kind of the greatest victim, say, of imperialism of the 20th century, so meaning the Jews and the Holocaust. So therefore, it is incumbent also to understand the Jewish experience. So he's the flip side of what Martin Buber was calling for years ago about reckoning with the intrusion upon the Palestinian community. In this case, it's from the perspective of the victim, but it is reckoning with, okay, so how did the Jewish community get into this position where we became the victims, and how is it that we can move on? And so he writes out a shared history, which I find a very elaborate, much needed continuation of what Buber had called for many years ago, that the two communities need to deeply understand each other. So Said, unlike Buber, is in much better position because he obviously both knows the Palestinian community, but certainly knows the Jewish experience quite well.
And then you have Ella Shohat, who writes from a more specific perspective, that of an Arab Jew, who was also an Israeli.
Yes. Yeah, so getting to Shohat, she's the pioneer in critical Mizrahi scholarship, so meaning the Arab Jew. So she's looking at Zionism and also Arab nationalism from the standpoint of, say, the Arab Jewish victim in the sense that they don't fit in well either. They don't fit into the standard Zionist model of what it means to be Jewish. But under pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism, they don't fit into the model anymore of Arab nationalism because they're Jewish. And so her extension, say, like to Arendt and the original Humanist Zionist, is that it's not just that the Mizrahi Jew in Israel was a victim of the Ashkenazim. She does point that out, in a very powerful way. So they're a victim of Orientalism, and that the Arab Jew is still, the Arab part is still considered suspect and inferior. But she's bringing out that this is what tribal nationalism, the idea of homogenous nationalism where a people can only live with its own, that Zionism really just doesn't know how to deal with the Arab Jew. other than trying to extricate the Arab element from the Jewish element. And so she links both tribal nationalism and Orientalism. Orientalism meaning just seeing anything that's Arab as inferior. And then, the affirmative part about her is, and she made me think about this, is that if one wants to think in an historically grounded way about coexistence among the Jewish and Arab communities, the Mizrahim offer the best model. That is, they have years and years of coexisting among Arab communities. So in terms of thinking about a rich heterogeneous coexistence, that the Mizrahim offer that model. Of course, the trick is to reckon and understand how is it that the Mizrahi community became right-wing under Israeli society, and how to think through and revive this idea that they actually are a model of how to think about coexistence and how to update coexistence. So between Said and Shoha, one gets a rich sense of reckoning and reconciliation across the board that's neatly, I think, neatly completes what Buber recognized had to happen, but didn't have the historical knowledge to develop.
Final topic I'd like to discuss with you is the historical analysis in your book, notwithstanding. It's a book that's very much about current realities and future possibilities. When you look at the situation today, particularly the composition and policies of Israel's current government, how do these relate to the development and trajectory of Zionism in Israel, not as it could have been, but as it actually has been?
Yeah, I'm going to quote from a passage of a warning from Hannah Arendt. So she's predicting this, right before the war ends. The land that would come into being would be something quite other than the dream of world Jewry, Zionist and non-Zionist. The victorious Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that would submerge all other interests and activities. The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be a concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. In other words, yeah, they may very well win and get their Jewish state, but it's going to be a very unpleasant militarist Spartan state. And so she may have overstated what it looked like at first, but it is a logical progression of a state built on forced acquisition, on maintenance of Jewish supremacy. So the core elements of mainstream Zionism, of a type of tribal nationalism that rejects the idea of living with other peoples, and the demand to be ever vigilant and to have a siege mentality. All those things are just coming to fruition under current year. So
and you would characterize these, I presume, as consequence more than aberration.
Yes, more consequence, yeah, right. Yeah, so in other words, the root elements, which is another reason for me writing the book, is beyond just, trying to come up with what a more just coexistence would look like, is stepping back and reckoning about how did it come to be this way? What was there initially exciting, that attracted, particularly genuine socialists, that attracted them to Zionism way back, and what were the seeds that made it into something that's just so ugly now?
But another concern of yours, of course, is, in addition to Jewish self-determination in your writings about Israel, is the US Jewish community. And how has this trajectory that we've just discussed influenced political attitudes within this community? For many years, it appeared to exist in this contradiction of being overwhelmingly liberal or progressive in the US context, while at the same time providing uncritical support for Israeli policies similar to those most of this community opposed in, for example, the southern United States or Vietnam, has an increasing visibility of the one-state reality as constructed by Israel laid bare these contradictions and produced significant changes? How do you look at this issue?
Yeah, it is a complex question. My feeling is that, yeah, the American Jewish community has been traditionally liberal, particularly on domestic issues. I would say its foreign policy as a whole has been supportive. I mean, you could say it's been a liberal imperialism.
Mhm.
So yeah, when the Vietnam War became quite unpopular, then yeah, the American Jewish community by and large also turned against the Vietnam War. But it didn't fundamentally question the core premises of US policy, like including in Latin America and so forth. And so it wasn't too much of a stretch for it to accept the quote strategic unquote relationship of US Israel, and even kind of this, this language that never made much sense of shared values, in the sense that Israel didn't have shared values really of democracy, particularly if it meant coexistence with other people, but neither did the US. And so perhaps it was a shared hypocrisy that they had. So I don't know if it was that tricky. That is, maybe Jews
Well,
are.
I think what you're saying certainly is I think a very accurate characterization of liberal elements of this community. But you would also in the past quite often come across more progressive elements of this community who did identify, for example, with revolutions and liberation struggles in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. But when it came to the Middle East, had a completely inverse relationship to reality.
Yeah, it definitely existed, and I can think of people who were in that camp, particularly years ago. I don't know if that was kind of if they had an important voice on U.S. policy. Maybe they delayed left groups from sharper criticisms, but I think that the American Jewish community, particularly after 1967, followed what Mark Ellis, this radical Jewish theologian, calls a Constantinian Judaism.
It was also referenced extensively in your book.
Yeah, I have a long section on him. So the idea that part of the Jewish identification became just associated with Israel and defending Israel. So it became a diaspora community that saw advocacy of Israel as very important, strong opposition, both to non-Jews, but also to those Jewish dissidents that were challenging that perspective. And I think, to get to the second part of your question, there is an opening. The opening is, it's now just so crude how the Israeli government is behaving. So they don't have these voices like Shimon Peres who can sound, fairly eloquent or fairly reasonable. That's maybe not eloquent, but fairly reasonable at an abstract level. It's not just Netanyahu. If you have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich,
Not the iron fist and the velvet glove.
Yeah. It's really hard to frame this as other than just really brutality, and calling it liberal democratic is just becoming more and more of a stretch. So that's depressing, obviously, in the immediate sense, but it is pushing bigger sectors of the American Jewish community to rethink their connection to Israel. So far, it's not pushing, say, the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, the American Jewish Committee, or even like on college campuses, it's by and large not pushing the Hillels on college campuses, but the population at large. I just saw a Pew survey from 2022. It's close to 60% of American Jews 18 to 29 now have an unfavorable view of Israel. And so I think there is a hunger for thinking about new ways to think about Israel. And what I hope for my book is to think one doesn't have to just take it aside and just not think about Israel, but it can think about alternative possibilities of how you can still hold on to some notion of Jewish self-determination.
Jonathan Graubart, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Oh, thank you, Mouin. Likewise.